Um, Before we go to Norma, you're going to be next. I'm going to read a couple quotes, which I think are important. This is a quote from James Baldwin. The state of Israel was not created for the salvation of the Jews. It was created for the salvation of Western interests. The Palestinians have been paying for the British colonial policy of divide and rule and for Europe's guilty Christian conscience for more than 30 years. And I wanted to read also a quote by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Security is often used as a justification of oppression. And I think if you read anything in the mainstream media, you're going to see that popping up over and over. And I think it's important also to just to remember what Pappé's statement about settler colonialism. It's always about the elimination of the native. And in the case of Israel, it's also the case for Israel. And so it's that idea of the elimination of the native that's a key idea that happens in all settler colonial states, and distinguishes them from just plain old colonialism. Okay, Norma.
Hi, people. Are you using the chat, anybody? I've posted a lot of brilliant comments on it. One is from Paul LaRudy. I've thought that he is better known than it seems he is, but he's an activist that I've been familiar with for several years. I wrote him a question. I said, why didn't the Jews that were traveled by boat, why didn't they just get into Palestine and integrate the same way people integrate into America, the refugees and so forth? And he says, well, because they didn't want to be. They were coming behind a book by Theodore Herzl from the late 1800s, that they were to have their own land. And they inferred a land only of Jews. This was the basis of the gathering of many Jews into Israel, ultimately behind the Palmach and all those heroes of murder and horror upon the people who were living there. We went there to live, to immigrate there foolishly. I did not understand the situation, and found out there had been banana trees on the land that we had created ugly, and pomegranate trees. And there was never a land without a people.
Are you done there? David, you want to, I guess Norma stopped there. So David, you want to speak?
Yeah, I absolutely get it that there's a deep history here that needs to be fleshed out. At the same time, there are 30,000 odd people who've been massacred. And I think that's the entry point into arguing with anybody. I mean, it's no accident, and you can go back to Israeli massacres in the past, but 30-odd thousand people are being massacred. It really doesn't matter whether that's genocide or not. It is still abhorrent. So that's one point. The second point I would make is that by and large, Jews in Europe had a reason to go to Israel, had a reason to leave Europe that was not intrinsically against the Palestinians. I would guess that the majority of Jews who migrated from Europe to Israel were getting away from Europe rather than trying to create a supremacist Jewish state. So that's my second point. Thank you.
Jews.
I don't see any hands up. Did anybody else like to speak? Otherwise, I'm going to throw in a few more votes at this point.
Pam's hand is up.
Oh, go ahead, Pam. You have to unmute, Pam.
Pam, unmute.
Okay, well, I heard this on the radio last week, I guess. I don't know who was saying it, but the UK didn't want the Jews in their land, and that's why they were helping out them to establish the Israeli state. That was interesting. So that was the motive of theirs, so-called motive. Thank you.
I don't see any hands up. I'm going to read a few. I'm going to open a few questions here that kind of have popped up in other talks I've heard. And one person posed a question. And some of these questions are sort of obvious, I think, for this group, but I think they're worth hearing. Are settler anxieties, so this is talking about the West Bank, that Palestinians might seek revenge for their colonial actions, for the settler colonial actions, more important than the Palestinian anxieties associated with daily IDF killings? So that was, and if you ever have seen any of the documentaries on the West Bank, you start to realize how that's built into the enforcement system. And another question was posed, do Palestinians have to be the perfect victims in order to earn American sympathy? And for so many years, it seems like that was kind of the case. And another question that I heard posed, does the slave owner have a right to self-defense from the enslaved? And similarly, does the colonizer have a right to defend its colonization? And I think those were useful questions to think about. Norma, go ahead.
There have been people saying what we need to cause by our support and assistance, for one thing, is to enable the right of return, and alongside of that, tell the people, let the people be able to say, we want one state for all the people who live here, to form a structure by which we can all take care of ourselves. Now that's frightening as hell. The slave owners don't want us to have a place where we can take care of ourselves together, because that's socialist. That's what we want, to help the people be able to come to say that they really want everybody to live well, including the people who were exiled into the Bantustans.
Okay, before we go to Bill, I'm going to pose one other question. Who has the right to use violence in a conflict between an oppressor and the oppressed? That's an important question to answer, because often, there's fingers get pointed to, well, they were using violence, so it must be met. But, who do you think has the right to use the violence? Did the enslaved in the South in the 19th century have a right to use violence to overthrow their oppressors, those who own slaves? So I think those are important questions to ask. And I'm going to make a little suggestion here too, on a book I read recently by Chomsky and Ilan Pappé. I don't know if you can see that. Is that reversed or is that a thing? But it's On Palestine by Chomsky and Pappé, and a good short read, discussion, written in 2015, so well before the current um, uh, slaughter and murder that's going on in Gaza. Bill?
Yeah, well, in response to what you just mentioned a moment ago, of course, one recommends reading Frantz Fanon and his defense of not just the use of violence, but the role of violence in general in terms of the resistance to colonialism. But as regards the other question, um, and this is one of the problems I guess I have with the slogan "From the river to the sea," or at least the way it's interpreted, is that it confuses what will happen to Israelis, and especially Jewish Israelis, um, in regard to some kind of settlement. And I, even though I have been part of you might say, the culture of the left, where it was a matter of faith that we defended the slogan for a democratic, secular Palestine. And I recommend, if you haven't read some of the works by Ali Abumina, in addition to, of course, subscribing to Electronic Intifada, which is one of the best sources of information on all this. I think the fact is that yes, it's conceivable that there could be a la South Africa, or those things didn't turn out great in South Africa, uh, but that there could be some resolution, or there could have been some resolution. Let's put it that way. I'm not sure that's possible now. Uh, for two reasons. One, I already stated that uh, there is, I believe, an Israeli nationality. That does not give them the right to do what not only they've been doing since October 7th, but what they've been doing all along. And I think the fact is that uh, you can't get around that. And so the other side to that is, as you said, one cannot sort of downplay the right of return. And so that is the big contradiction. And then the other part of this, of course, again, is the international situation. And the U.S. now is trying desperately to play what they've tried to play, not only since Oslo, but even before that, which is to get other Arab states to take responsibility. What they would like to see right now is a all-Arab peacekeeping force to come in into Gaza. That's not going to resolve things. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying there's any easy solution, but I think all these things have to be factored, and we can't simply say wait for the Arab Revolution. Either it's maybe some years down the road. So, thanks.
So I'm going to jump in here before I go to Norma. One thing that you said, Bill, about from the river to the sea, I should point out that Netanyahu said the same thing about pushing all the Palestinians out of that greater Israel, and so concern about what might happen to Israelis within Israel should Palestinians get full rights has to be weighed against what's actually happening to Palestinians
Right.
in the apartheid state, which is, it's again, and if you want to look for historical analogies, I think South Africa provides that, because South Africa, what it did is there were concerns that the blacks in South Africa were going to somehow take revenge upon the whites in South Africa once the power change and apartheid ended. And that just didn't happen. It was all just imaginary, and that really, and I think this is again, when you're an oppressor and you've perpetrated such violence on a people, in your own mind, you're worried that they're going to seek revenge, but that's mostly in the mind of the oppressor for the most part, and it seems like there could be a single state solution, which is what Ilan Pappé is pushing for. Norma?
Yes. Recitation of that tautology that you, of course, James, have refuted correctly, but that Bill was reciting is very popular. Why people think that they should sit in judgment to say, well, maybe it can't go on, and maybe they can't have the right of return, and maybe they can't have the people getting together. I mean, we're not dealing with people in, I call it kindergarten, but we're not dealing with people who don't know anything. Those people know all this stuff. And I'm convinced that the tautology has to change and never be said again that, well, those people, they're going to be angry and this, and of course they're enraged. Of course the people in South Africa were enraged. Of course the Black people in the United States and the natives have been enraged, and properly so. I, as a communist, a deep communist, a third generation communist, am constantly enraged from the time I was 9 years old. I'm furious, and I'll give up anything to discourse with people over coming to be able to build a socialist structure, a structure in which we can all live together. It has to be talked about if we intend it.
Okay, before I go to Greg, I'm going to toss in a couple more quotes. These are from Ermate, and he said, occupiers don't have self-defense rights. They have obligations. And I thought that was a really, really insightful observation. So the Israeli government has obligations, that should be applied to those, to the West Bank especially, and to the Gaza Strip. They don't have any self-defense rights in those areas. And another thing he said is that ethnic cleansing is not self-defense. And that's one of the things that keeps getting repeated over and over, is that Israel is defending itself. It's just using self-defense. But this is ethnic cleansing, and that really is, they should not be equated. Go ahead, Greg.
What I want to talk about is not so much the right or the wrong, the moral reasons of why what Israel is doing is wrong. I would like to look at it in terms of power, of why did the white minority in South Africa end up relinquishing its total domination and control, so that we have a different situation now in South Africa. And I think it's because of the power relationships, particularly United States and Europe, at some point thought it was okay for the white minority in South Africa to relinquish the control. Whereas right now, in regards to Israel, Europe and especially the United States um, don't at all want Israel to relinquish control. And I think part of that, of course, has to do with the way the U.S. views other Middle East countries, especially Iran. You know, they want to have a base there, which Israel provides. So in terms of thinking how there might be some sort of reasonable solution, it seems to me that as long as Europe and especially the United States um, want Israel to be maintained as a power base there, I don't think anything along the lines of South Africa or any other reasonable solution is gonna happen. I just want to get people's reaction in terms of that, kind of power dynamic um, view of why this is such a mess.
Go ahead, Bill.
Well, I agree with Greg. Generally, the geopolitics of all this, are always one of the key underlying factors. And after the Iranian Revolution, not saying that things changed completely, but it made a very different dynamic. But the difficulty, and of course the Israelis also jumped on that as well, knowing that they had much greater leverage. So, it's very difficult to separate out, all these geopolitical factors with what's going on internally. But what is clear is that those settlements within Israel, um, including the labor movement, the Histadrut, is so heavily invested in this system that it's almost unimaginable at this point for them to, uh, have some kind of independence. Or, I don't know how that dynamic will change, but it's clear that the right, has so dominated. And when I say not just Likud, but these fascist organizations, for them, I don't know if people know who Jabotinsky was, but he is you might say, the spiritual father of Likud, and he functioned within Nazi Germany up through 42 or 43, trying to recruit people to go to Palestine. But he would be a moderate compared to some of these people, and so what's going to prevent this blow? I'm not in any way defending, just to respond to Norma, the politics of not only this regime, but the politics of Zionism in general, going back to Herzl. But what I'm saying is that one has to look at what will be the road to some kind of resolution. There's no way there'll be a total military defeat a la Dien Bien Phu for the Israelis. I will add, though, this has not been a very positive factor for the IDF. No matter how many people they kill, they are not built to fight this kind of war, and they haven't been doing well. So, but these kinds of things have to be weighed against what can we do, not we, but what can Palestinians and those forces that are, and I include Hamas. There will be you can't simply say, Well, yeah, we support the Palestinian cause, but we're really not gung-ho on Hamas. There are a lot of criticism of Hamas, but you can't have a solution without them. So anyway, I'll stop.
I'm going to read another quote. This is from On Palestine, which Pappé and Chomsky put together. And I think this is from a section that Pappé wrote. Palestine is facing several paradoxes that are hard to reconcile. And I like the idea of paradoxes in terms of understanding it from a geopolitical perspective. The first paradox is the gap between the dramatic change in world public opinion on the issue of Palestine on the one hand, so there's been a dramatic change, and the continued support from the political and economic elites in the West for a Jewish state on the other. So there's a big difference. There's a big difference between what the majority of people in the world believe and what the Western elites that control much of the world believe. The second gap, indeed paradox, is the one between the widely held negative image of Israel on the one hand and the very positive image its own Jewish society has of the state. So the Jews inside Israel just really think that they're the most wonderful state that can be, and that IDF is the most humane military in the world. It's a bizarre paradox. And the third paradox is that while specific Israeli policies are severely criticized and condemned, the very nature of Israeli regime and the ideology of Zionism that produces that nature, these policies are not targeted by any solidarity movement. So individual actions, there really is this thing where the movements aren't really looking, or at least in the past, this was written in 2015, haven't targeted, the very foundation of Israel, which is Zionism. And it's good to see it now being targeted. And then the last paradox he mentioned is the tale of Palestine from the beginning until today as a simple story of colonization and dispossession, yet the world treats it as a multifaceted and complex story, hard to understand and even harder to solve. And I think this comes to something he said in some of the stuff I've read, where it's not that understanding the conflict is not difficult. Settler colonialism is not difficult to understand. What's difficult is to figure out a solution, a decolonization solution. And that's the real solution that Pappé talks about, is Israel has to be decolonized. And that is the difficult solution. Norma?
In school, they teach that the Arabs are Nazis. They've taught themselves that the Arabs are Nazis, and they're teaching it to the children. It's incredible. I mean, I was here when they changed Palestine into a Jewish state. Well, there had been no arrival of a Messiah, which I knew there wasn't and didn't exist and couldn't happen. And then they began treating the people that lived there in that way. Where did that come from? They had just escaped that experience coming down on them throughout the rest of the world almost. And now they were doing it to this group of people that they had opportunity to put their hands against. Ugh. I say it could change in a flash. In a flash.
I'm going to go to another quote. Well, the desire to turn the mixed ethnic Palestine into a pure ethnic space was and is at the heart of the conflict that raged since 1882. This impulse never condemned or rebuked by the world that watched by and did nothing. The international silence in the face of this crime against humanity transformed the ethnic cleansing into the ideological infrastructure on which the Jewish state was built. That's again Ilan Pappé in his book on Palestine.
Good.
That's enough. Let's go home. Oh, okay.
Well, can I one quick comment on that? That people sort of assume that the vast majority of the Israeli Jewish population is Ashkenazi. Earlier, they did represent a fairly strong majority. That's not the case, and it hasn't been the case for some time. And it's a curious and sad, and it's not just Russian Jews coming. That's always raised. Going back to 48, and I'm blanking out on the term used in Israel for Arab Jews, who lived actually before 48, lived a very well integrated. They didn't suffer any kind of vast persecution. You read about Egyptian Jews, their books, Moroccan Jews, etc. But because tension was created by the establishment of Israel, many of these people felt they had to, and there was pressure, I think, to go to Israel. And sadly, many of these people now represent, there was a rebellion, I think, in the 70s or 80s. They used the name Black Panthers. But many of these represent the hard rock of the Israeli right. So again, it's one of those contradictions that's, you know, I'm not sure the explanation other than that they, just like poor whites in the South, didn't want to end up on the bottom. So anyway,
So I'm going to close this down with one last quote that I think is one I like. Zionism was a movement made by people who did not believe in God, but God nonetheless promised them Palestine. So with that, I think we'll.
You saw my comment about that there are American Jews of some population in Israel, right? I'm just to add to the mix. And yes, there were Jews living in Palestine long before all of this was going on, a couple hundred years, at least. Did you see my post from that fellow Paul LaRudy? He sends this PAL box of olive oil and hummus and so forth to people to buy it to support the Palestinian struggle. He's very dear. He lives here on the West Coast, Berkeley-ish and so forth. The quote that I put into the chat talking about that I asked to find out why people weren't coming and just integrating, and he said because they didn't want to.
By the way, if people are going to buy items from Palestine, I highly recommend you support Mecca, which has, been a stalwart of the struggle here. They're actually having an event tonight, I believe. But if you go online, there are all sorts of items you can, and they have people in Gaza, by the way.
Well,
Middle East Children's Alliance.
Yeah, there's a bike ride for Palestine that they're actually as a fundraiser that's going to happen in July for anybody who has a bike and wants to participate. Get your friends to donate and have a nice ride on what'll probably be a nice warm day. I'm going to close with one last quote. The Christian Zionists, which I think people forget, there's a lot of Christian Zionists around, wanted the Jews to return to Palestine because they could precipitate the second coming of the Messiah. And they were also anti-Semites. It was a 2-for-1 deal, as they would get rid of the Jews in Europe at the same time. So that's another comment from Chomsky and Pappé's book.